And I guess I will also say it's just been actually really great to be here for the 2 months that I've been here and to have an affiliation with the KU Leuven. And it isn't the first time I've been here. I've come for a number of different occasions. But this has really been a very special opportunity for me to work with Sascha on this very long gestating project, which we hope to actually see through to completion within, a reasonable human span of time. But
before death.
Yes.
That sounds still human. Okay, come, we're going to start. Ty and I are going to attempt to present to you the book we've been working on for a long time, as Ty has explained. Our first conversation about the possibility of this book, in fact, took place already in 2010 at a conference in Glasgow, of all places. At that point, Ty and I had each separately already cultivated a strong interest in the relation between avant-garde cultural production, time, and history. And prompting us to foster this interest had been at least two phenomena we had seen happening around us in the world of contemporary arts and cultural practice. The first was that a new discourse had begun to take shape around or about contemporary art, that is, art as it had been with us since the fall of the wall. As a swath of critics and theorists had begun to argue, and as they still argue today, in fact, contemporary art is perhaps above all defined by a heightened awareness of issues of time and history. Art today is therefore frequently said to have taken a temporal turn, to display a marked understanding of contemporaneity, that is the simultaneity or coevalness of a multiplicity of temporalities operative on a global scale, or a historical turn, an archival impulse, an artist taking up the role of historians or archaeologists. Now, this new understanding of contemporary art, which has also led to a renewed broader scholarly interest in problems of time and temporality, we did not contest, of course. Yet, each of us being modernists like you, and each of us in addition having studied aspects of the 20th century avant-garde for several decades, we naturally also thought that this contemporary fascination with issues of time and history had a prehistory that went at least as far back as the early 20th century avant-garde, and that was perhaps also worth unearthing and recounting. The second phenomenon we had been seeing or had seen happening around us in the world of contemporary arts and cultural practice was possibly even more significant to our eventual decision to team up. This was what, by now, 15 years later, can easily be described as a return of the avant-garde. Indeed, at least for the last 20 years or so, have seen a surge of new artist formations, both in the West and beyond, that either explicitly or often in thinly veiled manners have again come to present themselves as operating in an avant-garde lineage. What is more, albeit at times reluctantly and hesitatingly, a spate of interesting critics and theorists as well has begun or has again taken up the term avant-garde in discussions of contemporary art. The second contingent facet, this return of the avant-garde in both theory and practice, suggested that it would not just suffice to write the prehistory of contemporary art's attraction toward issues of time and history. It also suggested that the very history of the avant-garde itself had to be written from our present-day vantage point.
So Sascha has laid out a bit of the formative context for our book, and I'll dive in and give you first a sense of some of the basic concepts and arguments that we'll be pursuing in the book, and then subsequently we'll talk a little bit about what the different chapters entail. But I'll start with the title, which is The Time of the Avant-Garde, the Long Century of Making History in the Image of Art, because in that is a kind of compressed conceptual argument about the book overall. So the title signals both the chronological span of the book, which itself is potentially a contentious point, which is the long century emerging in the first decades of the 20th century, but also extending into the period following World War II, and in our view, up to the present day, with no necessary end in sight. It's of course essential to speak of the avant-gardes as an early 20th century phenomenon, And it's also not highly controversial also to consider the later neo-avant-gardes of the post-war as encompassed by the time of the avant-garde, despite several authoritative and sharp criticisms of this second generation avant-garde. But there has been a very considerable investment of intellectual and critical effort, both in earlier theories of postmodernism and now of contemporary art, both verbal and visual, to argue that the avant-garde's time is over and that something new, a new period mode, has succeeded it. We argue in contrast that during the past century plus of the avant-garde's existence, such manifestations have reappeared consistently, and that moreover, only from this extended historical perspective can we understand the noisy claims of avant-garde artists and writers, their works, their social and historical meaning, and their long-term development. Our title also encapsulates the other major argument of the book, which is that the avant-garde's engagement with history, that the avant-garde engages inventively with history according to a chronologic of its own. We characterize this avant-garde approach to history as making history in the image of art. This entails taking the conceptual value of avant-garde works and practices still more seriously than have even its most sympathetic critics. The figural and representational forms, principles, and organization of coherence and mediations through which the avant-garde shaped their eccentric dialogues with the historic past, lived present, and imagined future are, we argue, evident not only in their manifestos and other discourses, but also, as above all, as embedded in avant-garde works and practices themselves. We hence propose a mode of interpretation applied to a wide range of examples, spanning from the early 20th century to the present, that reveals the avant-garde's constructive reworking of historical time in the image of radical, innovative, and inordinate works of art and documented practices, and ultimately with the chronopolitical aim of contesting what Jürgen Habermas calls false normativity in history, and presenting their own transformative alternatives. The avant-garde, as we argue, is manifested over the course of an open-ended, long century, emerging historically in the first decade of the 20th century. We, like many scholars and theorists of the avant-garde, utilize the conventional periodizing heuristic of the historical avant-gardes up to World War II, the neo-avant-garde following, adding to it the rather more controversial notion of contemporary avant-garde that emerges at the end of the Cold War and a new phase of global capitalism that became evident around the turn of the millennium. Conventionally, however, such a heuristic serves to typify high-level general qualitative differences between the activities and products of one or the other period, but it also implies connections between aspects of the art and literature in question and the large-scale macro-contextual forces of the age. At times explicitly, and sometimes only tacitly, it's been suggested that the avant-garde gets its genesis as a response to a moment of historical crisis. For instance, the imperialist crisis leading up to World War I and the Russian Revolution, or after World War II, the crisis of the Cold War division into competing blocs, the crisis of Europe brought about by anti-colonial and national liberation struggles across the imperial colonial world, or even a more general crisis of man provoked by the horrors of war, the Holocaust, and the atomic bomb. This view then conceives of the avant-garde primarily as a reactive formation, a response to crises that are prior both chronologically and ontologically or causally. Our focus on the avant-garde's chronopolitical dimension suggests an alternative relationship of avant-garde to crisis, and therefore to context, that has previously been explored to date. We note that on some occasions one can draw a relatively clear line from a preceding social crisis to an avant-garde manifestation, but just as often there's no such linear path from one to the other. So, for example, while the years leading up to the outbreak of the First World War were certainly full of growing social tensions and conflict, the emergence of the first wave of the historical avant-gardes preceded the war. And let's recall, just to choose one instance of significant timing, that the first issue of the Vorticist journal Blast appeared on July 2nd, 1914, while the war broke out in July 28th. It's the second issue of Blast, published more than a full year later, that's entitled The War Number. Similarly, the futurist journal La Cerba was founded in 1913, well before Italy's entry into the war, for which the futurists actively propagandized. On the other hand, we're left with asking why certain truly grave historical crises do not seem to have lent their impetus to the avant-garde. So for instance, why is there no significant avant-garde surge following the crash of 1929? Why did the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, for the most part, not give rise to new avant-garde currents, at least outside of Germany? It's fairly easy to explain why not in Germany. The explanation, it would seem, the explanation of crisis leading to avant-garde manifestations, works when it works, and if it doesn't, we just pass over that crisis in a little bit of, embarrassed silence. Rather, if there's a relationship of the avant-garde to crisis, we would suggest it's less that of a causal line from crisis to avant-garde, and rather that of the avant-garde's own projects of crisis that might anticipate, or at least in a chronopolitical sense, stand in a syncopated relation to a crisis-ridden historical context. And we can talk a little bit more about what that idea of a project of crisis means.
We can. With the relatively long span of a century in mind, we've sought to define the avant-garde as the dialectical confluence of three traditions that together lend the avant-gardes their distinctive characteristics. We call these traditions the ontological tradition of the avant-garde, the critical tradition, and lastly, the chronopolitical tradition. The ontological tradition is associated with the very definition and nature of art, and with respect to the avant-garde, with the unsettling possibility that art or literature in this new mode might name something that is much more diverse and much stranger than we had previously guessed. This tradition unfolds with an unstoppable dynamism through often violent contention within the domain of art, issuing into that proliferation of new forms, figures, and materials that is thought characteristic of the avant-garde. The ontological tradition would seem to take its impetus from the avant-garde's attempt to shake free of the burden of history and invent, in the free space it has accordingly won for itself. But, as numerous critics have suggested, this foundational stance may render the avant-garde, for all the violence of its rhetoric, impotent in any real historical or social domain beyond the sphere of art in which it exercises its intensely focused and constrained powers. This tradition has often been convinced or conceived by critics as constituted through a series of negations and breaks, often with the further implication that either through extrinsic causes or out of its own self-consuming intrinsic logic, that the avant-garde exhausts itself and dies out at a particular moment in time. We will, as should already be clear from what we have said, want to complicate this association of avant-garde with negation, and describe what has often traveled under this blanket notion with a more nuanced vocabulary of disruption, differentiation, and deviation. The critical tradition seeks to remedy this limitation by flipping the card of the relation between artistic innovation and socio-historical context. Here, the avant-garde's recurrent artistic contestation of what already counts as art is referred to the historical and socio-historical conditions that supported the dominant forms of art and its reception. This tradition depended on the extension, always tenuous and subject to fall back into a merely symbolic gesture, from the avant-garde artwork's contestation of aesthetic norms to a broader challenge to the norms and structure of society at large. It's within this domain that the phenomenon of a revolutionary avant-garde with various historical avatars in Futurism, Berlin Dada, Russian Constructivism, Surrealism, Situationism, the Black Arts movement, and even perhaps in new groups today, becomes imaginable. Yet the history of the avant-garde, narrated predominantly from the perspective of the critical tradition, is typically a tragic one, in which exalted revolutionary enthusiasms and utopian hopes are followed by new sobrieties. Moreover, the revolutionary orientation of the avant-garde has often been associated with a classical conception of revolution the Jacobin-style occupation of the state spanning from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution. As that revolution became less and less tenable in the 30s and fully closed by the political changes that ended the socialist system in the late 80s, so too the avant-garde dwindles and disappears, by this account at least. Complementing some of the limits of the ontological and critical tradition, finally, and eschewing their negative trajectories as well, there is the chronopolitical tradition. This tradition, we argue, represents an important and still under-discussed complement to the first two traditions. It's especially to this tradition that we look anew when we characterize the avant-garde as making history in the image of art. We suggest that this tradition derives from the avant-garde's heightened awareness and reflexivity concerning their own historicity and the role of their artistic work may play in actively giving new shape to it, making a history of their own in the image of art, in the image of avant-garde art, that is. In continually being required to justify its own status in the present and within its now problematic historical antecedents, the artists of the avant-garde achieved a heightened consciousness of the contingent and mediated construction of history itself, and hence history's potential to be remediated in art's image. Of course, we're certainly not the first to know the paradox of the avant-garde's seemingly paradoxical persistence, its constitution of a tradition or traditions, which would seem to contradict its fundamental futural trust and commitment to action in the present, and which might also entail its ephemerality and rapid obsolescence. Harold Rosenberg, for instance, decades ago identified a tradition of the new in modern art, and Adorno spoke of the aging of the new music, even as he brought the rapid cycles of isms in proximity to the swiftly recurring oscillations of fashion. We believe, however, that they took only a partial view of what was going on with the extension of the avant-gardes for the whole, more complex process, and interpreted the typical intermittence of the avant-gardes, their going in and out of latency under certain conditions of reactivation and retreat, for their linear decay and closure. But they took to be a unidirectional subsumption of the historical avant-garde into, in Rosenberg's case, the mainstream of art historical tradition, and in Adorno's case, the tendentially post-historical space of administered culture and culture industry, we would argue should actually be regarded as an increasing foregrounding of the avant-garde's chronopolitical character, which comes into ever greater relief as they extend further into the 20th century and beyond. So besides redescribing a process that has often been thought to have discredited the historical avant-gardes, which are then basically seen as failures, and to have precluded any authentic neo or contemporary avant-garde, we also offer a novel definition of the avant-garde as a distributed but distinct field of practices and objects that, with different degrees of dominance or even foregrounding, are situated within all three avant-garde streams, the ontological, the critical, and the chronopolitical.
So these three traditions of the avant-garde, the ontological, critical, and chronopolitical, encompass the field of avant-garde works and activities across a variety of works in different media and over an extensive period of time. Yet they still do not serve to answer a basic question. Why and how did these traditions arise in the first place and continue to develop? Now, one part of the story is a familiar one. The latter half of the 19th century, first and foremost in France, but quickly taking hold elsewhere as well, saw the declaration of independence by loose groupings of artists who sought to break free, both aesthetically and institutionally, from officially supported art of the academies. Hence the various groupings of independents, refusés, secessionists, free artists, brotherhoods, and so forth, that emerged with increasing rapidity, and we can point to the Salon des Refusés of 1863 and the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874 as landmarks here. Historians have drawn a clear line of derivation from this original modernist break, this is a term that Jean-Joseph Gueux uses, to the emergence of the avant-garde, as might be suggested by Marcel Duchamp's famous gesture of Semitic as ready-made fountain, to the Society of Independent Artists first exhibition in 1917, better known as the Armory Show. In a sense, Duchamp, who was himself on the judging committee of the independent show, was at once culminating this independent space of free art, as well as showing the limits of its internal development by asking just how far could this very capacious evaluative standard be stretched until the judgment that that's not really art could fall. This emergent modernism then, turning away from the accepted standards of the academies, represented an ontological challenge to art that was defined and supported by academic training, its hierarchy of established genres, and its system of rewards and advancement. So repeatedly, we see already with Impressionist and Post-Impressionist artists that they were subject to doubts about whether these were works of art at all, rather than just unfinished canvases or pulling the leg of the public or incompetent delving, just as naturalist and symbolist writings might be dismissed as pornography or the scrawlings of a madman. Through the modernist eschewing of artistic standards underwritten by the official institutional support, they found their work exposed to an unprecedented degree to the public and the market, where the vicissitudes of journalism and the oscillations of fashion played a destabilizing role. Jean-Joseph Gueux, notably himself part of the Tel Avant-Garde literary circle, has suggested that we consider this shift in light of a large-scale economic shift in capitalist society at this time, in which consumer desire and speculative risk-taking begins to play a new role in creating a more volatile value system for that very bourgeoisie that could choose to invest in safely conventional artistic bibelots for their homes, or perhaps make a greater speculative risk, perhaps on an insider's tip on a lesser known artist whose value would only become clear at some later point. And we can really think of the role of writers, for instance, Emile Zola, Finion, later Gertrude Stein, Lajos Kostok, Ezra Pound, Roger Fry, and André Breton in encouraging such bets on new and unconventional artists. We can understand this as an emergence of a new value regime that not only touched the realm of capitalist economy directly, for instance in the stock market, but also reached into the aesthetic realm through emergent consumerism, advertising, fashion, design, and a new high-risk, high-return market of modernist art. Arguably, while these currents impelled radical formal changes within a rapidly evolving modern art, it's not evident that any quantitative accumulation of innovations in form would alone suffice to tip dialectically in or around 1909 into the qualitatively new modes of art and writing that the avant-gardes inaugurated. For that additional catalyzing factor, we must rather look carefully towards the other side of the bifurcated art world of the late 19th and early 20th century to the manifestations of aesthetic historicism in architecture and art. And it's a little bit of a paradoxical story that we'll be spelling out here. By aesthetic historicism, we mean the dominant mode of official art that evokes historical styles and creates an ideologically sanctioned sense of pastness. Perhaps the most obvious art form to start a discussion of aesthetic historicism with is that of architecture. As standard histories of architecture in the West teach us, the development of this art form from the late 18th into the early 20th century can be characterized as a string of revisitations of older historical styles, from Hellenism, Neoclassicism, Louis XIV and XV revivalisms, Nordic neo-romanticisms, neo-Gothic, the Romanesque, Renaissance, Baroque, and so on, all with neo attached to them. But it was not only in architecture that historicism reigned, but rather across the arts and applied arts, and so as to create encompassing environments, not only in the public spaces of buildings and monuments, but also in the domestic spaces of bourgeois households. Walter Benjamin colorfully spoke of the, quote, narcotic historicism of the 19th century and recounted that, quote, the alternation in styles, Gothic, Persian, Renaissance, and so on, signified that over the interior of a middle-class dining room spreads a banquet room of Cesare Borgia, that out of the boudoir of a mistress, a Gothic chapel arises, or that the master's study in its iridescence is transformed into the chamber of a Persian prince. In his classic study of the avant-garde's emergence in France from 1855 to 1914, the banquet years, Roger Shattuck reminds us that for all the artistic effervescence of the proto-avant-garde that is his main subject matter, at the 1900 International Exposition in Paris, which saw more than 50 million visitors, so really truly a mass medium, 50 million visitors, and introduced both new technologies and new modern styles such as Art Nouveau, the atmosphere of aesthetic historicism still dominated. And he writes, for more than a year after the April opening, the banks of the Seine for a mile on both sides of the Trocadero were transformed by exotic buildings, or at least exotic facades. Paris looked and acted like an overblown Venice. Venice being for the soon-to-be futurist Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the ultimate symbol of passeism, worthy only of having its moonlight murdered. Aesthetic historicism played two important functions. With respect to the private bourgeois, nested in the bibelot-packed apartment in a fashionable affluent part of the city, it asserted cultural capital through the display of fine, expensive, gentroid evidences of taste. In public space, however, it gave cultural aesthetic testimony to the power of the state, its institutions, and the persistence of the values of its gentried elites. For the revolt of the avant-garde is not merely an aesthetic shocking of the bourgeoisie at the level of formal taste culture, or even of just a violent recoil from the tight image of the smug respectability of the successful moneyed bourgeois, seeking to secure his place among the elite without the traditional sanctions of blood or land. Because aesthetic historicism extended from the private domestic interior to the often literal terrain of the state, it could supercharge aesthetic revolt with a socio-political and ultimately a chronopolitical significance that is properly definitive of the avant-garde. Moreover, while aesthetic historicism in these social functions was in an important sense conservative, serving to express the rising economic power of the bourgeois in the cultural forms of the gentried elite and enforcing the interests of the state, it also, aesthetic historicism also, from the other side of an emerging modernism, also represented a disruptive force in the nexus of economic and aesthetic values. The availability of historical styles as purchasable objects of art, design, and fashion wares, and also of experiences of theater, music, artworks, literature, drew history into the rhythms of commerce and finance. As Friedrich Schwartz has noted, late 19th century criticism was rife with complaints about the degradation of historical styles as they descended into fashion and design, such that by 1900, Stil, style, which became a conceptually loaded term that art history sought to actually redeem and re-inscribe in a scientific way, but Stil and Mode, style and fashion, had become almost equivalent in journalistic and other public discourse. Paradoxically, in its perception of the almost unlimited disintegratability and disposability of the semiotic matter of history, the avant-garde had whetted its blade on the bronzed feet of aesthetic historicism. Already before the outbreak of the First World War, the avant-garde broke the back of historicism, so to speak, bending its backward-looking head to also face the present and future, or all at once, for as Siegfried Gideon reminds us, the notion of simultaneity was of course key to the avant-garde at this stage. For if historicist works never simply presented copies of the art of the past, but always a mosaic of citations and forms that in a given culture evoke a certain period, they nevertheless did reduce the singularly anachronic nature of art to evoking a sense of pastness, even if on occasion they did that to criticize the present. To the avant-garde, this was an untenable reduction of the peculiar historicity of art because it obscured art's potential and vital role to conjure up different views of the present and the future as well.
So the ultimate result of the avant-garde's encounter with aesthetic historicism was threefold. First, the avant-garde came to redefine in a fundamental way the status of the work of art. For if aesthetic historicism mainly kept approaching the work of art as a time-storing device, as the avant-garde pushed its logic further and came to redefine it as an active time-making device. As aesthetic historicism had made all too apparent as well, the arts being a rich repertoire of conventional means to reconstruct aesthetic views and experiences of the past, the aim now became to experiment with unconventional artistic means to also evoke the present and the future. Second, the avant-garde came to redefine the very nature of artistic work, labor, or production. And by embodying this newly understood labor as a social formation, also came to present itself as a truly revolutionary social agent. Third, and closely related to the above, the historical avant-garde also carved out a distinct function for itself in a larger political economy. For if aesthetic historicism made anything clear to the avant-garde, it was that the chaotic eclecticism of past styles reflected in a more broadly felt crises in the experience of time and history, and that a critical reworking of historicism's basic tenets thereby also held implications that went way beyond the merely artistic. Indeed, in a modern political economy in which time came to be regarded as one of the most significant assets, as we will see, an unbridled experimentation with time could have profound social ramifications. Thus, in a way, folding the history of art as in the ontological tradition, onto the historical actuality writ large, as in the critical tradition, the chronopolitical tradition of the avant-garde was born. The final point to make is that once we discern the role of aesthetic historicism in relation to the original genesis of the avant-garde, we can also see that it continues to play a role in new forms throughout the century of the avant-garde. If the original aesthetic historicism was a matter of the appropriation of historical styles in a proliferating accumulation inflected at once by fashion and state ideology, in later moments it manifests itself, for instance, in postmodernism's decorative views of allusion to historical styles, and in contemporary culture's archival retromania, impelled by an unprecedented storage capacity of recordings, traces, and digital simulacra. In order to characterize the persistent but changing nature of historicism, we distinguish between aesthetic historicism, what we call the later 20th century neo-aesthetic historicism, and finally, salvage historicism, what we call, or the form of historicism relevant to planetary capitalism today, in chaotic, disorganized capitalism. Whether they denounced or celebrated it, the most articulate critics and theorists, including, for instance, in architecture, Nikolaus Pevsner, Manfredo Tafuri, Robert Venturi, and Charles Jenks, or more broadly in cultural theory, Frederick Jameson and Andreas Huyssen, recognized this return of aesthetic historicism in new forms, which could even treat earlier moments of the avant-garde itself as material for aesthetic revival or reenactment. We seek to pay careful attention to the lineaments of this ongoing interaction between the persistence in altered forms of aesthetic historicism and the chronopolitical projects of crises of the avant-garde at different moments.
So coming to kind of another turn in our presentation with the expose of these the book's basic concepts, you now have a sense of the first part of our book, which in an opening chapter lays out the three avant-garde traditions, in the second chapter returns to the early 20th century for the genesis of the avant-garde, and in the third sketches the contours of the avant-garde as it developed and anticipated capitalism-induced crises in the later 20th century. In the second part of the book, 4 chapters turn to a series of related and we hope suggestive examples that traverse the avant-garde's long century and lay out the avant-garde's adventure across various art forms, from the visual and performance arts, architecture, music, and literature, to various time-based arts and installations. They also allow us each time to unearth developmental patterns over the course of the century as generational and cultural repetitions in difference of certain experiments unfold. In addition, each chapter also concludes with an intervention into discussions of the nature of contemporary, that is, post-1989 art. Part of our aim in this section of the book is to show that A, there's a longer avant-garde prehistory within the arts that predate the art currently produced in our multipolar world, and B, that not all contemporary art engaged in temporal or historical experimentation warrants the label avant-garde. As has been the case in earlier manifestations of the avant-garde, contemporary forms of avant-gardism coexist with a wide range of other modes of art. In staging our argument, we also present 4 chapters employing the dramaturgy of shifting scales, starting from the elemental and the minimal, and stepwise escalating to the maximal and even cosmic, following the artist in this way, not necessarily our own cosmic vision or something. Ranging from the microscopic to the telescopic, the 4 chapters dramatize different modes of the avant-garde's time-constructive work.
All right. The first chapter in the middle section, or second section of our book, discusses in an expanded framework a mode that is widely accepted as being characteristic of much avant-garde activity. We originally called it montages, but we went for assemblages. The assemblage, the relational arrangement of disparate elements which function not merely spatially, but also as differential tokens of time. Assemblage, we argue, exemplifies the modeling function of avant-garde works at their most basic and modest scale, albeit that assemblages can cover a spectrum from the radically analytic and reductive through a diversified ensemble of canonical avant-garde montage techniques to the most complex informational articulations and networks. Discussing a wide variety of examples across art forms and following a large body of precedent scholarship, we highlight the crucial role of technological mediation of historical experience for the development of the early 20th century avant-garde assemblage and its imaginative embodiment of alternative historicities. We further explore how the intensification and diversification of such mediation over the course of the long century of the avant-garde provides impetus for ever new forms of historically engaged assemblage practice.
So our second chapter in this section of the book, entitled Monuments, the avant-garde, it's surprising to observe, frequently experimented with conventional artistic genres that distinguish themselves in carrying out the work of historical memory. So for instance, portraits and autobiographies and operas on the part of Gertrude Stein, the historical epic, which was practiced, albeit in unusual forms, by avant-garde writers throughout the past century, from Marinetti and Andy Warhol to Alexander Kluge and beyond. History painting, which is often said to go into the eclipse in the early 20th century or even earlier, but which this chapter suggests simply went through a radical transformation in the hands of the avant-garde. And what is our main focus here, the monument. Focusing mainly on this latter, the chapter evinces how this time-honored and history-recording genre was radically diverted, reshaped, and refunctioned by the avant-garde. Discussing a wide variety of 20th century and 21st century artists active in different art forms, we demonstrate how the function of monumentality and the monument get increasingly nominalized and dematerialized at the hands of the avant-garde, almost to the point of symbolically dissolving the monument's conditions of possibility.
The next chapter, Social Plastics, we've called it, enlarges the scale of avant-garde imagination by discussing a series of artworks and practices that have set out to intervene in the complex social temporalities and rhythms that mark their context of emergence. As sociologists and anthropologists of time have amply demonstrated, social time, that is the collective experience of time in any given social space, is always a specific composition of multiple modes, durations, and rhythms of time. It's the result of diverse processes coinciding, colliding, and finding a temporary balance so as to temporalize collective experience and, above all, activate social power. Confronting the given temporal organization of social spaces, from site-specific communities to cities and beyond, many avant-garde artists across the past century have generated works and practices that imply arrest, redistribution, and social flows of the social and redirection of the social flows of time. They thereby also actively proposed models of action, from the cynically ironic to the almost deliriously visionary, to affect the actual denouement of social history as it unfolded. Through a discussion of its century-long experimentation, we demonstrate how the avant-garde's impulse to intervene in and upset social temporality has persisted to the present. If totalizing visions of history have increasingly lost their purchase for radical artists, the imagination of interventions in social time is in fact taking place in a remarkably expanded field today. Finally, the chapter Environments in this section deals with ways in which the avant-garde mobilizes alternative temporalities to relativize human history in relation to smaller and larger timescales, from the infinitesimal to the geological and astronomical. Part of the aim of this chapter is to thematize certain inbuilt limitations at work in the avant-garde's temporal experiment as it has unfolded so far. And there's at least two of these. First, the premise of a nearly boundless potential to reconstruct the world in the image of art. Second, the assumption of an indefinite span of time in which to carry out this work. Our increasing awareness of the ecological limitation of the human habitation of Earth itself has made these fundamental dispositions obviously increasingly untenable. In sporadic and inevident ways, this awareness has been hibernating in the avant-garde since the early 20th century as well, indeed concurrently with the avant-garde's most optimistic and grandiose manifestations. For more recent avant-garde artists, this awareness of temporal limitation has come into its own, compelling a rereading of the avant-garde genealogy to which they are indebted. So while on the one hand critiquing a number of classic examples of the historical avant-garde which envisioned the total transformation of natural and human history, we on the other hand turn to later 20th and 21st century examples where this consciousness of limitation is integral to the historical imagination of the work. Continuing the avant-garde's chronopolitical project, the more recent examples discussed project different temporal modes of survival, which have increasingly become necessary to any credible future-oriented historical project. As such, this chapter adds a further modulation to the avant-garde's constitutive relation to the revolutionary and redemptive time that has been amply discussed in previous chapters. The latter-day avant-garde increasingly orients towards a mitigated space of reform, repair, and revaluation as it carries out its work of remaking history in the image of art. All right. Excursus. This is the last bit before we conclude. Let's make our revisionary reading of the avant-garde more concrete with a set of examples. While our various readings of the 20th and 21st century avant-gardes in the middle part of the book go out of their way actually to nuance this, we basically see the century-long history of the avant-garde unfold in three ideal typical, the stress is really on the ideal type nature of this here, three ideal typical phases. While we cannot unpack this tripartite periodization in full here, we, or you, may wish to return to it in our discussion, but perhaps we can give you at least a minute to take a look at it. And it says here, pause. Can you actually read it there? Yeah, okay. Is that long enough, do you think?
Not literally a minute, but it's fine.
In each of these phases, you will see, the avant-garde interacts with changes in the temporal and spatial organization of the capitalist socialist totality, represented by the two bottom lines in this chart here. In each of these three phases, too, the avant-garde relates to changing dominant trends within art, as well as with the evolving forms of aesthetic historicism, which we already discussed. And these are represented here in the middle section. And finally, when you look at them in isolation, each of these three phases in the development of the avant-garde also come with their own chronopolitical and aesthetic program that not only accentuates certain aesthetic categories, certain dominance, if you want, but also advocates a distinct form of subjectivization through art. Now, okay. The first phase is that of the historical avant-garde. And for this, Bruno Taut's book, Die Auflösung der Städte, the dissolution of cities, can in many ways be taken as a key example. It's just crazy. The Dissolution of Cities is a book that appeared in 1920 presenting itself as a utopian architectural alternative to the modern urbanism that had, in the eyes of Taut and others, led to the devastation of the First World War. As Taut had it, the pre-war capitalist city had represented the Abgrund der Menschheit. Informed by other architects involved in the so-called Gläserne Kette or crystal chain correspondence, by makeshift abodes, bohemians and refugees had started to erect on the outskirts of cities while working the land for themselves, as well as sourcing from various scientific and parascientific thinkers. Taut believed that now the German lands lay in tatters, the time was ripe for a radical alternative form of cohabitation to assert itself. The Dissolution of Cities, and the book actually is here, or at least a reproduction of the book, contains or consists of two main sections that lay out his plans. The first is a list of 30 hand drawings on different colored papers that demonstrate how over time a new type of grassroots, anarchically and organically shaped society could come to erect itself if we would relinquish the idea of rebuilding the social space of before the World War. In this new society, where everyone would build their own separate private abode, for this machine labor as well as industrial agriculture would cease to exist. Technik ist jetzt etwas ganz anderes als in der Fabriksteinzeit. Instead, private ownership would be abolished. Der Begriff des Besitzes ist verschwunden, and everything in the public space would be shared collectively. This emphasis on the collective is key, as Taut's plans also clearly present themselves as yielding a new type of human, a new subject that would still retain a degree of singularity but cease to be individualist. This is why Taut ultimately also presents the future city as one in which criminal law and punishment are abolished, as well as one in which die völlige Unverhülltheit in Geschlechtsdingen, sex, would come to displace the nuclear bourgeois family. Schools too would disappear, children would develop themselves according to their own talents and enter collective work or labor at an early age. Art as a specialized professional activity would be dissolved, but also sublated in a generalized transfiguration of life. Die Kunst ist Sache für sich, die Kunst als Sache für sich ist abgelöst, alle sind von ihr durchdrängt. So art is now everywhere. If Taut in some more or less projected a new type of natural, agrarian, organic society that did away with the old, what he did not relinquish was the notion of religion. For the new unitary force in Taut's projected utopia would be an overcoming of history by realignment with cosmic time through a human spiritualization of the cosmos. And the last sort of images in the book, here for instance you see the Earth from up in the sky, and you can see how lights sort of shine into the cosmos. This is an image from the Earth looking into the cosmos. And in the final drawings, you see how the whole cosmos, everything becomes one.
And there's inscriptions all over that say Heidi, Heidi, Heidi,
Heidi, Heidi, Heidi. In the second part of the book, through no less than 82 pages of quotations from sources that leave little doubt about Taut's own anarcho-socialist political inclination, Taut then goes on to present his views. Important here is that Taut himself never speaks in these 80 pages, but that through a collage of citations, among others, and most elaborately from Petr Kropotkin, but also from the Constitution of the USSR, as well as from the writings of Friedrich Engels, Gustav Landauer, Lenin, German Jewish sociologist Franz Oppenheimer, and some of the first global art historians, such as Ernst Fuhrmann, he enacts an already collective subject who speaks with and through the wisdom of others. Throughout both parts of the book, however, what is rather striking is the absence of any visual representation of this new subject in situ. His work, rather, is concerned with giving form to this new society, and an expressive total form at that. In Taut's strength universe, the smallest bits are also the dialectical expression of the most encompassing cosmic ones.
So now taking the step from the historic avant-gardes to the second phase of the neo-avant-garde, we'll pass on to the New Babylon project of Constant, who was a founding member of the Internationale Situationniste and an inspiration for the anarchist Provost movement in Amsterdam. Around 1955, he began to explore ideas about art and habitat that would crystallize into the New Babylon project and take further impetus through his association with Guy Debord, from proto-situationist themes of psychogeography, urban dérive, constructed situations, the détournement of architecture, and unitary urbanism. From 1957 to 1970, the early 1970s, 1974 actually, when he ceased any further elaboration of the project, Constant tirelessly designed, modeled, theoretically articulated, and publicized his idea of the New Babylon, an elevated, networked city in which nomadic city denizens would move through a climate-controlled inner labyrinth of changing decor, experiencing a myriad of unrepeatable encounters and realizing an anarchic society based no longer on labor, but on play. New Babylon was intended not simply to overcome modernist urbanism a la Corbusier, which was organized around places of labor and dwelling, and the problem of circulating people and material between them, but also its very anthropological foundation in homo faber, in a laboring humankind, in favor of a new anthropological horizon of free time and play, realizing homo ludens on a universal scale. Beneath the elevated city where living and mobile dwelling take place, fully automated production takes place underground, while traffic and agriculture can take place on the surface. In an essay based on his 1964 lecture at the Institute for Contemporary Art in London entitled New Babylon, an Urbanism of the Future, Constant underscored the creative indeterminacy that the New Babylon was intended to house. And he writes, quote up there, New Babylon could not be structured to a determined plan. On the contrary, every element would be left undetermined, mobile, and flexible. For the people circulating in this enormous social space are expected to give it its ever-changing shape, to divide it, to vary it, to create its different atmospheres, and to play out their lives in a variety of surroundings. This project became first, mapping various kinds of cities in this way, but also then a network of world cities that would be kind of included in this same kind of flexible structure. Constant concludes by evoking the architectonic and sensory elements of New Babylon's interior as a sort of three-dimensional letristic sign system that can be syntactically articulated and rearranged as an aleatory outcome of the collective encounters taking place within it. As the name suggests, the New Babylon is associated with the old Babel, with language, with the ancient confusion of tongues. yet it also projects a futuristic Zaun-like or letristic superlanguage as well that affirms the language-making capacity of human motility, affectivity, and play. Basically, any way that materiality can be motivated to take up an articulatory relationship within and of time will constitute a new, singular, and ephemeral urban idiolect among the cacophony of tongues. New Babylon thus subsumes the old Babylon's derangement of language into a modern infinity of vibratory translations between inner and outer experience, between global extensiveness and ecstatic intensivity, all projected through Constant's artistic models and graphs onto a superlinguistic and ultra-metropolitan scale. For obvious reasons, Constant's work has received attention, especially from the point of view of spatial practice, the affective remapping of cities, interest in utopic and heterotopic built structures, and opposition to the homogenizing tendencies of modernist urbanism in favor of a radical, unitary urbanism of differences, in which the artistic construction of situations would be realized on a grand scale. But we want to stress a different, if related, facet of Constant's work, the complex, differentiated concept of time that inflects the meaning of such works or activities at several different levels. To put it in somewhat Kantian terms, if the post-war urban territory, poised in the midst of its capitalist urbanist transformation, constituted the external, objective form of situationist experience, then the temporalities nested within that domain would be its internal, subjective correlate. Constant's modeling and drawing of the ever-changing network of New Babylonian space should be understood as an ensemble of singular operators for connecting the external to the internal in new space-time folds and passages, or translating the intensities of spatial experience into temporal intensities of presence, memory, and desire. We might think of Constant's New Babylon as a great, boundless, fluctuating set of montage collisions between experience constituting elements. New Babylon thus represents not only a utopian reorganization of space, but also, and even more fundamentally, the institution of a new Babylonian order of time, intimately linked to a transformative subjectivity and existential identity. New Babylonians would experience an open temporal horizon in which all fixed points, and hence the experience of repetition, rhythm, and memory, would be undermined by the constant flux of the urban environment. The New Babylonian culture, Constant concludes, is based on the ephemeral, on the transience of an experience, and the contrast between this and new experience. We'll conclude by looking at an instance of what we characterize as the contemporary avant-garde. In 2008, the Iraqi-American artist Michael Rakowitz constructed White Man Got No Dreaming, which presents, along with planned drawings and cartoons from the life of Vladimir Taplin, a model of the monument through the Third International made of salvaged wood from demolished housing of the Aboriginal Housing Company of the Redfern neighborhood in Sydney. In Toplin's original design, which was to have been realized on a massive scale, the 3 interior levels or halls to be built within the tower's massive outer glass surface would take the forms of an interacting elemental geometry, incorporating a cube, a pyramid, and a cylinder. This intricate design was to become a rotating 3-level monument that would memorialize the feats of the Communist International, while also literally housing, the offices of the Comintern. Totlin's constructivist tower, had it been realized, would have become a moving space of communist praxis that would have functioned as the very axis of the still unfolding world revolution, which the edifice was to have proleptically commemorated. Totlin's design sought to lift the historical losses and victories of the communist cause out of ordinary time in history into a utopian no time, good time. Articulating an entirely new formal language on the basis of architectural monumental structures, Tatlin's tower broke with the past and began anew. Or as Viktor Shklovsky colorfully put it, the monument is made of iron, glass, and revolution. Thus rupturing temporal experience, the upward moving construction was meant to create a sort of temporal parallax from which the rapidly changing present and an open, indeterminate utopian future could be simultaneously experienced. In migrating Tatlin's tower from revolutionary Russia to contemporary Australia and constructing the actual work from salvaged wood scraps rather than modeling it in wood to signify the tower's eventual construction in steel and other technologically advanced materials, this is the product in salvaged wood, Rakovits calls in question the futural push of Tatlin's revolutionary monument. Rakowitz's tower would seem to speak more to the temporalities of survival in the contemporary world, the possibilities of reconstructing provisional sites of radical praxis, and to the temporal complexities of what we might call indigeneity in an expanded field, uprooted, urban, and globally as well as locally mediated. Rakowitz's tower also reinscribed the interplay of abstract, materialist, and representational dimensions of Tatlin's monument by lending his work a direct technological and communicative function. His work housed a transmitter for a local Aboriginal radio station, Koori Radio. When asked about his relation to Tatlin's project for his tower, Rakovits suggested that the very dissipation of its original revolutionary and Soviet context made it potentially mobilizable for new historical projects, albeit at the cost of weakening its radically utopian valence. He writes, he says, it's like using a symbol which is so iconic, almost like a graphic design logo for revolution, and looking at how it can envelop a lot of things. It becomes a semiotic thing. It's also about architecture, it's also about engineering and material culture and so on. I think by re-quoting it, it becomes a way to get beyond it, to have this material from the local context in Australia speaking to something that it's not related to. As the art historian Carolyn Christov-Bakarian adds, quote, what if we open up the word revolution and try to re-semanticize it, open up all the contradictory meanings that the epistemology of the word has, and we find it is in the same way as the Tatlin Tower an empty container. Put otherwise, we might say that Rakowitz's White Man Got No Dreaming, like the Baroque artifacts that Walter Benjamin studied in his Origin of the German Tragic Drama, the historic ruination of Tatlin's original utopian contents allowed Rakowitz to give allegorical expression to new historical meanings which nonetheless bear the traces of mourning for the lost utopian hopes of the early avant-garde. Salvaging the material remnants of these hopes and reconstructing them as a new exemplary and practical intervention into the contemporary situation, Rakowitz nonetheless also extends the radical legacy of the avant-garde to the horizon of disorganized planetary capitalism.
Okay, I'm going to conclude. It's almost over. From our present-day perspective, the now century-old avant-garde shows itself to us as an anarchic training ground that is each time established in anticipation of seemingly irresolvable capitalism-induced crises. Training our sensorium so that we become open to the possibility of imminent change, perceive historical development differently, and arrive at effectively registering hitherto unnoticed agents of innovation, it has continuously suggested and continues to suggest to us alternative forms and modes of being and acting, dwelling and moving in time and history. One of the basic arguments of our book will have been that we, as scholars, need to keep attending and remain open to the historical apertures the avant-garde to this day keeps suggesting to us. The avant-garde today still comes to us as an invitation to experiment with what some have called historical morphology, others meta-history. Key to many historical presentations of the avant-garde, after all, is the loosening of the ties between artwork and context, and an unconventional reknitting of both. The avant-garde, in other words, presents an uninterrupted penchant for an alternative experimental writing of history. Taking this penchant seriously as critics involves reflectively taking inspiration from the many forms and practices of the avant-garde to model new ways of putting together textual evidence and material artifacts towards a historical presentation. As Gabriele Schor and Okwi Enwizor, among others, understood, the alternative historical morphologies of the avant-garde more profoundly allow us to fundamentally rewrite history, as taking these morphologies seriously also attunes us to what Frantz Fanon already in the late 1950s called the experiential zone of occult instability that opens itself up in a culture when it is faced with deep crises that call for new articulations and forms of subjectivization. Exploring historical and cultural zones of opacity, giving them a temporal and temporary form, both the African avant-garde explored by Enwizor in his exhibition The Short Century, the century going, basically covering the process of decolonization of Africa, and the 1970s feminist avant-garde mounted in Schor's eponymous 2016 show demonstrate how attending to the avant-garde's alternative meta-historical models in itself very often amounts to re-entering and expanding history as well as historical experience, always training us to embrace emergent regimes of radical alterity, new subjectivities, ignored residual practices, as well as the potential of the now. The avant-garde for critics indeed comes with an ethics, a social role, and set of practices of its own. As these exhibitions, calling from the archive of the avant-garde, make felt, perhaps the best way to look at the avant-garde is to see it as a site of unusual Bildung. If historically, in the Humboldtian sense, Bildung meant a type of training that above all was to install the continuity of tradition along with the continuity of personality, then avant-garde building, this now century-old tradition of rupture, takes as the ground of a proper modern and late modern Bildung the disruptive, the disjunctive, and the rest. For as long as there will be a capitalist system pushing us towards the determination of what already exists, there will be an avant-garde to suggest otherwise. Thank you for not running away. Now please give us some comments. We worked really hard on this talk.